Welcome, class. So today we're going to learn about speech writing part 1. And the important thing here is that what I'm going to teach you here is not just applicable to speech writing. This is also applicable to composition writing. So a lot of the principles I'm going to be teaching you here are going to have a lot of applicability to this class and all your other classes in college that involve writing of some kind. So we remember from the first lecture on public speaking that there's a contract between the speaker and the audience, right? And the speaker's job is to speak to the occasion, and the audience's job is to support the speaker. Now, when the speaker is speaking to the occasion, now that's where we're talking about speech writing, because speech writing is what you actually say to mark the occasion, if you will. So there are two tasks then that you have to fulfill as a speaker when you're speaking to an audience. So the first one is you need to convey a message. And see, I have my really good stylus today, so everything is readable. Yes. All right. So the first thing you need to do as a speaker is you need to have a point, right? Like your speech needs to have some kind of effect. And we can remember that speeches can be informative, they can be persuasive, they can be entertaining, or they can be celebratory. And remember that speeches can be a combination of these as well. So when you convey a message in speech writing, you're trying to convey a point, okay? We're trying to go for some kind of effect. And it's bad if, for example, you were intending your speech to be persuasive, but somebody comes up to you afterwards and goes, "Ah, that was a really funny speech," and they miss the point, okay? So if that's the case, if people are missing the point or missing the effect of what you're intending them to do, that might have been something to do with how you convey the message, your speech writing. The second task is the larger one, and we're going to focus a lot on this too. Not only do you have to convey a message, but you also have to be able to do it while keeping your audience. And what we mean by keeping your audience is that you have to keep your audience's attention for the time span that you talk and not lose them, right? Because listening obligations are lower in larger crowds, we're not required to be as engaged as we are in interpersonal interactions. So in interpersonal interactions, it's really hard to zone out without getting caught, because in an interpersonal interaction, you have to give back channel feedback. You have to give the yeah, right, blah, blah, blah. But in public speaking, you're not required to do all of that if you're in the audience. Your requirement is only really sustained silence and looking at the speaker. But you can secretly zone out all you want. So part of your job as a speaker then is to find a way to keep your audience. Now, there are 4 ways to lose your audience. So the first way is through boredom. With boredom, what's going on is that your audience just gets bored. And so in boredom, there's studies that say like the average adult's attention span's like 10 minutes. Some will say it's like every 20 seconds. And one of the things to keep in mind about boredom is that it's always looming, okay? So anytime, like public speaking teachers will often teach you like you have to get the audience's attention at the beginning, and they'll call it you need to have an attention getter. And then the assumption kind of is, well, once you have their attention at the beginning, you have it for the rest of the speech. Not really. Once you get the audience's attention at the beginning, you also have to do things to keep the audience's attention throughout the speech. So what you have to have is attention getters and captivators in the middle of the speech as well, to make sure you don't lose your audience in the middle of your speech. Because here's the thing, boredom is always looming. And what that means is boredom never officially goes away at any point in a speech. It's always a possibility that's lingering. And so what you have to do is like think of boredom as this thing that keeps coming towards you, and you push it back, and it goes back, and then it starts coming towards you again, and then you push it back. That's how boredom is in most people's minds, is that boredom is this thing that keeps coming back, but we keep doing things to push it back. So as a speaker then, What you need to be doing is you need to be finding ways to keep the boredom at bay and make sure it's not coming through. Now, there are, of course, some problems that occur with boredom, like, for example, in this day and age with multitasking, cell phones, all of that, people's attention spans might be shorter than normal. Okay, so it's like it's almost to a point where it's not good for you to have such a short attention span. So you often hear about people saying like, you know, students don't pay attention in class, and like there's like, you know, the professors are like, well, you know, they just have short attention spans. But then students are like, well, no, the professor needs to be better at speaking. Well, it's a both and. Like both parties need to be better, right? Students need to be better about self-discipline. Professors need to be better about presenting. So you have to keep boredom at bay. And so in that way, public speaking is like a contact sport. The next thing you got to be able to do, the next way to lose your audience, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Next thing you got to do to make sure you don't lose your audience, confusion. Okay, so this is another way you can lose your audience. Audience gets confused by either what you're saying or what you're doing, and they end up having to spend all their attention span on trying to figure out what's going on. So with confusion, what's going on is your audience just got confused somehow. You either said something or you did something. That just, now what they're trying to do the rest of the time is figure out, okay, what's going on here? Math teachers face this problem, right? They're going over something in math and, you know, they're going over some equations or whatever. They introduce some concept or variable that nobody really gets, and then they keep going based on that concept and variable, and then by then you've lost all your audience because they're confused. They don't know what's going on. So hopefully a good math teacher will take moments to pause, ask questions, make sure students get it to prevent confusion. The next is distraction, the next way you lose your audience. So distraction is where your audience gets distracted by something. And there's either something in the environment that takes their attention away from you, or there's something that you generate. So there are basically three different kinds of distractions then. So you have the self-generated, and these are ones that you created. And a lot of self-generated distractions are things like the technicals that we've been working on. So ums and uhs, hand talking, swaying, all those little things that can be annoyances to audiences, those are self-generated distractions. So part of what we're trying to deal with in this class is trying to minimize those. So that way you don't have somebody at the end of your speech going, well, I was really distracted by how you had the lazy leg, you know, or something like that, and then they miss the point of your speech. Another kind of distraction is the environmental distractions. And environmental distractions are ones that occur in the environment. Okay, so why isn't this thing writing? Okay. So environmental distractions are things like outside noise. So like you notice when you're in class or something and you hear a bunch of people walking by and they cause a lot of noise and everyone kind of looks to see where the noise is coming from. So that's an environmental distraction. Now, self-generated distractions are ones that you can definitely have control over, okay? But environmental ones, to some degree you can, to some degrees you can't, because you can't control everything in the environment. You might be able to control some of it, but like if there's a loud noise coming, if a siren's going off that's driving by, you can't stop the police from driving by wherever you're presenting. So environmental distractions are very much possible. And lastly, we have preoccupations. And preoccupations are basically distractions that your audience brought with you before you even started talking. So everyone kind of has a story every day about them getting up, waking up, going to class, whatever. And things can happen either that morning or the night before that may cause distractions before they even walk into the room. So maybe somebody in your audience got a speeding ticket on the way to watching your speech. So now that they have the speeding ticket, all they can think about is just, oh my God, I got a speeding ticket. How am I going to pay this bill? And so when you start your speech, they're too busy. Oh my God, I'm going to pay this bill. And they're worried. Not much you can really do there. I mean, you can't control what happens to people before they come to your speech. And if they have that kind of preoccupation, there's not much you can do. And you have to what you try to do is, you just try to do your best you can, give your speech, and just hope that maybe this takes their mind off of it, but it's not always something you can do. So one of the things you have to keep in mind about public speaking is that just like anything in life, it's a game of percentages, okay? Like, you rarely ever do you have something that's like 100% anything, like 100% effective, works 100% of the time, wins 100% of their audience. So the key is to try to win as many as possible and try to lose as few as possible. If it can be 100%, great. But realistically, sometimes, depending on the crowd, the size, and all that, it's going to be something a little bit less than that. Lastly, we have offense. Okay? And offense is where you either said something that turned your audience off or turned them against you. So offense is like a distraction because it causes the audience to focus on something else, but it's also unlike it because it happens out of punishment, not because of a natural loss of interest, if that makes sense. So offense is different because it is like a distraction in the case that you're occupied, but it's not because it's out of punishment, not out of disinterest. There are two ways to offend your audience, and you've probably heard this before. Incompetence. So this would be a case where the speaker clearly doesn't know what they're talking about because either they're saying things that aren't true, so like they just have no fact checks, whatever. They just don't look competent, they just look nervous, or they just look like they don't know what they're talking about. So naturally, you're not going to take that speaker as seriously. And especially if they say something that's false, that's going to really offend somebody in terms of like, why'd they get that wrong, blah, blah, blah. So that's going to cause them to work against you. The other way is through immorality. Immorality is where you say something that's just flat out offensive. Like you offend your audience with some kind of slur, you show them something that's demeaning or offensive to them, and so people just get so caught, I can't believe he used that word, and so they just shut off, right? And so all they think about is how angry they are and how they're going to attack you on Twitter or whatever. So immorality is another way to offend your audience. So when you decide what you're going to do in your speeches, then what you have to figure out, what you need to do is you need to do the check down, okay? Whatever I'm going to do in my speech, is it going to bore them? And this is where a lot of you need to work. Like, you need to make sure you're not boring your audience. Is it going to confuse them? So if you're going to bring in a map, you better make sure the map is clear, right? And it's not something that's going to confuse them even more. Is it going to be a distraction? So is it something that you think will cause the audience to shift all their attention to that one thing and then stop paying attention to you? So I had one student, it was a class when I was TAing at Iowa. She brought in her puppies because she was doing something on puppies, like a presentation on puppies, and her puppies were adorable, and that was cool. But the problem was, like, they couldn't sit still, so they would rock. She let them run free during her speech, so the puppies were like running under the desk and stuff, and playing with each other and playing with students. So then the students weren't paying attention; they were waiting for the puppy to come to them to pet the puppy. And so a lot of people, they lost a lot of people through that. And then you have offense. Will it offend my audience? Now, incompetence, I think, is quite preventable. You just make sure you do your research and make sure that you know what you're talking about. Immorality, can be difficult sometimes, and some people are finding out the hard way that there are some things that just offend people that we just normally don't think would, but they do. So my best advice is just try to use your best judgment, try to think about who is in your audience and what they might be sensitive to, and just make sure to not hit those points. Oops. So to keep your audience then is to make a connection. That's the idea. Like when you're trying to write a speech or write a paper, the key thing you're trying to do is you're trying to make a connection so that they want to keep listening, okay? So that's what you should be thinking. How can I connect with my audience? How can I kind of get past all the formality and really get to talking to them as human beings? That's how you make a connection. So there are a couple of keys to success then that can help you do what we want, which is to win the audience over, okay? And let's get to how you can do that. You need to first off think about, so we'll put keys to success. You first need to think about natural level of interest, okay? So natural level of interest. And what you need to ask yourself is, what's their natural level of interest going to be in this topic, okay? Is this a topic that you think the audience wants to hear or learn about? Are they required to? If your topic is naturally interesting, then you have that going for you, and you don't have to maybe worry as much at the beginning about losing them. But otherwise, you're going to have to use captivators, especially if you have a captive audience who has to be there, even though they don't want to be. You got to really take that into account. You also need to think about complexity. How complex is your material? If you're giving a simple message, then just keep it simple. If you're going to be teaching math, or you're going to be showing some new technology and it has some science behind it, you probably want to match the complexity with the materials. So you probably want to have some visual aids. You probably want to have maybe a demonstration device if you're going to do something that's more complex. But if you're just going to give a message, like a speech to your, let's say you're a manager of a team, and you just want to say, hey, everyone needs to lock the door before they leave. You don't need to like, okay, here's a door, people, and here's a lock. We're going to put our lock in the door. You don't need to do that. You don't need to talk down to them. But if it's something that's complex, then of course you will. Always think about distractions. Okay? What distractions await in my environment and with my audience? And come up with strategies to deal with those distractions if they come up. So let's say you're going to give your speech outside, okay? And it's outside on campus where that little circle thing is with, the little benches and all that. You have to anticipate that there's going to be distractions there. There's going to be students walking by who maybe you don't want to really be chiming in on the conversation. There could be weather distractions. And so you have to think about, how do I deal with all of those scenarios? What if it starts to rain in the middle of my speech? Do I have another room that we can all go to? If students start coming by, do you have a protocol for dealing with unwelcome parties, if you will? So all of those things are things you have to figure out based on where you're presenting. And lastly, you want to think about sore spots. What are your audience's sore spots and how can you avoid them? So this is where you have to make sure you really know who you're talking to and what might offend your audience. So, if you're talking to a bunch of A-State people, you probably don't want to be talking about how much you love the Razorbacks and blah, 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 and they're the best football team ever. It's a sore spot probably for some people, and you have to be prepared to lose them if you're going to go that route or offend them. So all of this is something that it's a basic lesson that you learn in high school speech and debate, and it's called adapting to your audience. All of the things that we do in terms of preventing the 4 different ways of losing the audience and making a connection by their natural level of interest, the complexity of the material, the possible distractions and sore spots, all of this is doing this key principle, adapting to your audience. So one of the first things that Aristotle taught when he was teaching public speaking back in the Greek 2,000 years ago BC time, I don't remember what the year it was, but back when he was around, that was one of the first things they taught. Adapt to your audience. If your audience is a certain way, try to meet them halfway and present in a way that makes sense to them. Speak their language. Reach down to their level or reach up to their level and do what you need to do so that they find you sensible, okay? And so the idea of adapting to your audience then is that every audience is different, and so you have to make adjustments. And so planning these things out, complexity, distraction, sore spots, is the key to adapting well to your audience and making that connection. So in part 2, that's where we'll get into the technical aspects of writing.